Good day! In today's lesson, we will be dealing with determining textual evidence. In the course of your professional career, you may be asked to make evaluative statements about a given document. The document may contain properties and ideas that need to be evaluated. You may be asked to comment on the quality of the properties or the accessibility of ideas expressed in the document text. That is why you need to develop the ability to make evaluative statements regarding a text, which in today's video you'll learn. There are different ways on how you will develop your evaluative statements regarding a text, and the first one is determining the genre, author's purpose, and audience. These three have a bearing on the kind of writing style the writer will employ in his or her work. Now let's define these three. When we say genre, it pertains to a category of artistic, musical, or literary composition characterized by a particular style, form, or content. It can be narrative, descriptive, persuasive, expository, etc. While the author's purpose means its main goal or the thing that the writer wants to convey to the reader or audience, such as to describe someone or something, to narrate experiences, to persuade a person into a course of action, to give factual information, etc. And when we say audience, this pertains to people who will read a text, or this is for whom is the text addressed. It can be to the youths, to professionals, to common people, etc. You can determine these three through a careful reading of a text. Pay attention to the words used, to the structure, to the tone of the text, and so on. When you are already knowledgeable about these three, it will be easier for you to make evaluative statements about the materials you've read. Next is pointing out the most significant idea. The most significant idea in a text will differ from one reader to another, because there are some instances that what is important to you is not important to me. So it depends on how you view the text itself. That is why part of reacting to a text is pointing out what one considers to be the most significant idea. It may not be the same as the main idea. Rather, what a reader will consider to be the most significant idea will be dependent on the circumstances surrounding the reader's interaction with the text. Just like what I've said earlier, it depends on how a person view or perceive the text. It may be that the idea is new to the reader, or the reader has an experience or characteristic that makes a particular part of the text more appealing to him or than to others would. That's why he or she may consider it as the most significant idea. Next is avoiding too much subjectivity in making an evaluation. When we say subjective, you are using too much of your emotion, or your judgment is much influenced by your emotions. Always remember that in making evaluative statements about a text, it requires that one must avoid being too subjective or being too critical of the text. A comment that is too subjective is not acceptable to educated readers. They often see it as invalid and not credible. Now, how to avoid subjectivity? To avoid that, you must stick to common and accepted standards and measures. These standards include moral standards, acceptable ways of reasoning, and declarations made by reputable bodies. Another way is to recognize and guard against one's bias toward the author, because a reader may develop bias toward a writer based on religion, gender, ethnicity, economic status, age, educational level, political affiliation, etc. Sometimes when we are reading a text, we have this kind of mindset that if the author of the text is an American, we quickly formulate an idea in our mind that this text will be really good. Another example, if a foreigner writes a feature article about a Filipino culture, we'll tend to react and ask if whatever he or she writes they are reliable. Since he's a foreigner, he may not be able to tell everything about our culture. Another example, a person from a developing or third world country writes about technological topic. Do you think what he or she will write will be good or accurate? So we tend to question their work. So those are some of our biases. One important way to avoid bias is to focus only on the ideas expressed in the text and not on the person or the author. Next is evaluating the strength of an author's arguments. In evaluating the author's claim or stand, you need to evaluate if the author's arguments are strong enough to support them. You also have to analyze whether the claims are reasonable. One important way to evaluate the strength of arguments is to trace the logical, step-by-step approach of the author in building his or her statement. Because it is possible for an author to give a perfectly reasonable or correct idea only to follow it with a faulty idea. This is what we call non-sequitur or does not follow. Let's have examples of sequitur. HIV is transmitted through sharing of needles. Mosquitoes also transmit HIV because the body part they use for sucking blood is like a needle. As you can see here, the first statement, which is HIV is transmitted through sharing of needles, is correct. However, in the second statement, which is mosquitoes also transmit HIV because the body part they use for sucking blood is like a needle. It is a sequitur because this one is a faulty idea or not true. Mosquitoes cannot transmit HIV. Next is evaluating the wording of the author's claims. The way an author states his or her claims has a strong bearing or impact on how acceptable the claims are. An author who uses broad, generalizing words will require more substantive evidence or considerable proof that is true for all cases. On the other hand, an author who qualifies his or her claims and emphasizes the conditions that make the claims true will not need to provide a lot of convincing evidences to back up the claims as much as an author making generalizing claims would. Next is differentiating arguments based on evidence versus arguments based on rhetoric. Authors who back up their claims using reliable facts, statistics, or logical reasoning use arguments that are based on evidence. Some authors use emotional words and other rhetoric devices. Rhetorical devices are examples of non-logical means of persuading readers to accept an idea. Example of this is the use of euphemism. Euphemism is a word used to substitute for another in order to make it more acceptable to the reader. On the other hand, dysphemism is the opposite version of an euphemism. It is used to make a word more irritating and unacceptable to readers. Now let's go back to the previous statement I've said earlier, which is, there are authors who back up claims using reliable facts, statistics, or logical reasoning, use arguments that are based on evidence. And there are also some who use emotional words and other rhetoric devices to persuade people, which is the euphemism. It is possible for the writer to use euphemism to make acceptable something that is unacceptable. For instance, a writer pushing for the legalization of gambling may refer to it as gaming instead. Another example, they can call people as freedom fighters instead of rebels or terrorists. So see the effect? For you to understand further the difference between the two terms, let's have other examples. For euphemism, we have unmotivated. For its dysphemism, we have lazy. Euphemism, human rights activist. Dysphemism, rabble rousers. Euphemism, gift. Dysphemism, bribe. Euphemism, adultery. Dysphemism, indiscretion. Dysphemism, jobless. Embarking on a journey of self-discovery, that would be our euphemism. Blasphemous, homeless. Euphemism, urban outdoorsman. Instead of saying short, you may say vertically challenged. That is euphemism. Instead of saying not smart, you can use his elevator doesn't reach the top of the floor. Instead of saying late, you may say chronologically challenged as euphemism. Instead of saying liar, you can say economical with the truth. Instead of saying prostitute, you may say comfort woman. Instead of saying old, you may say over the hill and picking up speed. Instead of saying going to the bathroom, you may say making a deposit in the porcelain bank. And instead of saying died, you may say dearly departed. Instead of saying overweight, you may say full-figured as euphemism. Instead of saying menstruation, you may say riding the crimson wave. Instead of saying garbage man, you may say sanitation engineer. Instead of saying wrinkles, you may say laugh lines as euphemism. Instead of saying baldness, you may say a little thing on top as euphemism. Instead of saying gay, you may say butting for the other side as euphemism. Instead of saying blind as euphemism, you may say visually challenged. Instead of saying stupid as euphemism, you may say intellectually challenged. So that would be all for today. I hope you've learned something from me. Thank you.